Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor. Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. Today, you guys are in for a very special treat. We're going to be talking about PKD, polycystic kidney disease. We're going to be talking about kidney disease, and we have a very special guest, an esteemed professor from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and who had quite an interesting career and is leading the way, I guess, with very interesting clinical work that we'll hear more about.
Good.
Jack, edit that part out. Today we're joined by Thomas Weimbs, who basically started his career as PhD in Germany and started in a lab in Cleveland Clinic, his own lab, looking at sort of cellular biology, and that's where he started his work on PKD. And for the last 18 years, he's been at UCSB, and there he's a full professor in the molecular and cellular biology department, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And most recently, he started a company to focus on dietary interventions for PKD and is doing a lot of clinical work. I'd love to hear more about that. What caught my attention was twofold. How we sort of interacted. I'd say we both, criticized a serious paper, a paper from the journal Serious, or I don't even know how they pronounce it. Serious, is it Serious?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. So we saw a paper on a case report that we both felt similarly that the authors had inappropriately attributed the kidney disease to the dietary intervention. And we have both sort of written comments about that on the paper. And then he's been publishing on PKD for a long time. I've seen his work from several years ago. And most recently, several weeks ago, another very important paper looking at ketogenic diets and PKD and kidney outcomes was just published, and he was an author there. So I'm very, very happy. Can we do first names? You can call me
Yes,
Tro.
of course. Yes, Tro, thank you.
And Thomas, so I'm very happy to have you here, and I'm excited just to hear sort of about your own career and how it's progressed, and maybe eventually we can talk about this new paper and your new company.
Super. Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. It's really great to be here. I'm a big fan, by the way.
Yeah, so can you start? The feelings are mutual, by the way, but can you start? So, here you are, probably one of the leading experts in PKD, starting a company that deals with sort of dietary interventions. Can you help me understand, how your career started, what your interests were, and how, you mentioned back at Cleveland Clinic, you were researching PKD, and certainly you've been at UCSB, and you've put out more work. So can you walk me through how sort of your interest in the kidney and kidney health has progressed throughout your career, and what got you started? I mean, from being a postdoc at UCSF to starting your own clinic, and then more recently.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so I kind of started out, of course, as a PhD graduate student way back then in Germany, where I'm from, hence the accent, where I did protein biochemistry work, and then moved over to San Francisco to do postdoctoral research at UCSF, where I switched to more of a cell biology work, looking at membrane trafficking. And it so happened that our model system of interest was just kidney epithelial cells, because they were, they're easy to use in culture and so on. And then for my first faculty position, I moved to the Cleveland Clinic, as you mentioned, to the Department of Cell Biology, And I was fully planning to just keep working on membrane trafficking, all the kind of the fundamental things. But luckily, fortuitously, a wealthy family out of Cleveland that had close ties to the Cleveland Clinic, they approached me, and they have polycystic kidney disease in their family. And they essentially offered me funding to work on PKD because they really wanted somebody at the Cleveland Clinic to work on polycystic kidney disease, and nobody was doing that at the time. They heard of this new assistant professor who works with kidney cells, and I probably exaggerated a little bit how much I knew about polycystic kidney disease at the time. And they essentially, funded my lab, gave me funds to hire a postdoctoral researcher to work on a project. And as a new assistant professor with no grant funding yet, that's a thing you would probably normally say yes to, which I did. So we looked around the literature, try to find out where there are gaps in the knowledge where we could contribute something. Came up with some ideas. I hired a postdoc, and we sort of almost quickly got some really interesting data that led us to discover this whole involvement of mTOR, the mTOR pathway in polycystic kidney disease. So that led to a big paper. We had another big paper early on where we looked at some other signaling functions on STAT transcription factors and so on. And then my first NIH grant was actually on polycystic kidney disease, as opposed to all the membrane trafficking things that I was initially planning on doing. And it's been going strong ever since. So essentially my entire lab works on polycystic kidney disease these days. And after 6 years and 6 winters in Cleveland, I decided to move back to California. I was recruited over to UCSB, which was great. Moved my whole lab over here, and have been here for 18 years, and focusing on PKD this whole time. But of course, initially, the first many years we had, like everybody else, had looked at what are the molecular pathways involved in polycystic kidney disease? How could we influence them with, pharmacological approaches? And until we sort of stumbled almost by accident on a finding that put dietary interventions on the map for us. And that had to do with sort of a crazy, adventurous grad student in my lab who decided to influence the mTOR pathway in kidneys by just simply feeding his mice with less food. So he put him on a caloric restriction regimen, and he didn't ask me, and I wouldn't have thought this would work. But then one day he came and to me and said, "Hey, I did this experiment, and the mice are fine. I gave them." It was only a very mild reduction in food intake, about 23%, which didn't affect the body weight gain of these mice. They were not malnourished. They were completely healthy. The only thing that was different is that their polycystic kidneys didn't grow. So they were much smaller compared to the ad libitum fed mice, which was stunning to me and to everyone in the lab. And we essentially wrote up the paper on it and said, hey, if this works, caloric restriction seems to be very effective. We have no clue why. Of course, mTOR goes down and, all the things you would assume, but we really couldn't explain it. And then we spent, another few years trying to figure out why this actually worked and could nail it down, not to caloric.
Sir, what year was that? Can you help me understand? Because
that was so the first paper I think came out in 2016, I believe, which was essentially saying, caloric restriction somehow influences, cyst growth. And then in 2019, we published why we think it worked. Yeah, go ahead. You have a question on your mind?
One sec, just for the listener who may not be as technical as you or I. maybe I can give a clinical background on polycystic kidney disease, and maybe you can give more of the scientific background, or you may be able to do better for both. Polycystic kidney disease, is characterized by, kidneys with cysts. Oftentimes, it can result in some decreases in kidney function. And in some cases, it can lead to requiring kidney transplantation or dialysis. Maybe for the listener, good doctor, maybe you can help us sort of round out what this disease, what the toll is on the human life. Like you're researching it, you're sort of catalyzed by this benefactor and this philanthropist to research this thing. But what is the human toll of polycystic kidney disease?
Absolutely, really important. Thanks for bringing that up. I was already launching all into the science here. So polycystic kidney disease is a genetic disease, inherited in most cases. So it runs in families. It is essentially a genetically determined form of chronic kidney disease. So chronic kidney disease, or CKD, is kind of the main complication in polycystic kidney disease. There can also be extrarenal complications, but really the biggest problem is that patients progress towards renal failure eventually, and then of course have to be on dialysis and go on a kidney transplant waiting list and hope for kidney transplant. So it's a little bit different from
common, if I remember, surprisingly common, right?
It's surprisingly common. Yeah, it affects over 1 in 1,000 people. So so it's a fairly common disease. Of course, not as common as diabetic kidney disease. Which is affects 10% of the population. So
interestingly, you can treat them both the same, right?
Exactly, right. Exactly.
I imagine.
Yeah, so I'm actually thinking that most of the progression of any type of chronic kidney disease really follows the same path, involves the same pathways. There's always fibrosis, there's inflammation involved, and so on. But in polycystic kidney disease, it's sort of like predetermined that somebody would have the disease. And
I have a problem with you saying that because of your own work.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
That's actually a really good point. So it was always thought to be predetermined in the sense of, okay, you got the gene mutation, there's nothing you can do about it. And literally to this day, almost every single patient gets told this by their doctor. They get told, it's a genetic disease, there's nothing you can do to influence the course of the disease. And that, I think, is not true anymore. And we have been working very hard to look into this and basically think that yes, of course, somebody has a gene mutation, they essentially have polycystic kidney disease, but that doesn't mean that the progression of the disease is predetermined, or the speed of progression is predetermined, because even within the same family where everybody has the same mutation, different generations have the same gene mutation, the rate of progression can be dramatically different, from one person in that family tree to another. One person might progress to renal failure at age 70 and another one at age 40. And it's been always pretty mysterious why that can be so heterogeneous and with even the same mutations. And we think that really a dramatic determining factor is the diet and lifestyle. And, we can go into all the many different mechanisms there, which is actually a good thing, because that means that something anyone can address. The doctor can address it with their patient. The patient can actually do something themselves. And sort of like on the human impact of the disease, it's considered a somewhat slowly progressive disease. Most patients progress to renal failure, in their 50s, maybe 60s, around about that. So oftentimes after they've already had kids. That's why, the disease, keeps on going, of course, and affects multiple generations. And about, 85% of the cases have a family history, where one of the parents had the disease already. So it's a little bit different from other forms of a chronic kidney disease where for the patient it comes oftentimes unexpected out of the blue, that never heard of anything affecting the kidneys before. But in polycystic kidney disease, most patients know about the family history. They have already seen, a parent, a grandparent, uncle, aunt, and so on go through the same process. So it's very much on their minds, which also means that they actually are unusually highly motivated to do something about it. I think, I've talked to many nephrologists, and they love the PKD patients because they are, much more motivated than many other chronic kidney disease patients, and they really want to do something about it.
Well, I want to, sort of highlight some things that you mentioned here. One is, I've stopped being able to count how many chronic and progressive diseases can actually be ameliorated by diet. Diabetes, chronic kidney disease, PKD specifically, mental health issues, metabolic issues, metabolic syndrome. So, I'm not surprised that there's a huge reversal in this space, and maybe we'll talk about that. That your work has literally reversed this idea that PKD is just genetic and there's nothing to do and just live with that. In fact, your research gives hope to people, and battling the kind of inertia behind the fact that there's this common myths in modern nephrology that says ketones and protein and fat is the most harmful thing you can do for a kidney. Has been a challenge in my profession, and I'm certainly imagine in yours even more so. But so I want to rewind because you're back there. You have this renegade, postdoc who's like, calorie restricting some mice, and all of a sudden, PKD improves. So that's a big deal. And the story unfolds even more interestingly, I think, in the next couple of years. I remember seeing your, other publications, which I hope you'll mention. So what happens next? So like 2016, 2017, he finds the renegade, guy, and then you've built on that since then. And I think it's really culminated over the last 3 years. But can you walk us through how you go from calorie restriction, maybe mTOR, and to now, hey, maybe there's something else here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the key epiphany came when that renegade grad student told me how he did the experiment, with the, lower food intake. And he did it exactly how everybody else in the field had always done it for years and years. You have your control ad libitum group. So they have, a mountain of food in their cage, and the mice nibble all day long. And you just measure, how much do they eat on average per day. And then you calculate, okay, I want to 23%, reduce the food intake in my experimental group of mice. And you just weigh out, the exact amount of food you want to give them. You put it into the cage every day. So every day you put like a predetermined amount of food in the cage. And so my renegade grad student casually mentioned that, oh yeah, these mice, they consume all their food within an hour. And because, he, as a grad student, he had to actually take care of the animals himself. And that changes things. If a mouse eats their lunch, breakfast, and dinner all at once within an hour, that means for the remaining 23 hours, they have no more food. So they're actually fasting for 23 hours,
which for a mouse is like long.
It's a lot, yes. So they actually go into ketosis. So after about 12 hours of not eating anything, a mouse, crashes down in ketosis, how they're supposed to be, based on evolution. And then you feed them again, and they go back up into carb burning mode, and the cycle continues. So what we quickly figured out is it has nothing to do with just simple caloric restriction. It has everything to do with the metabolic state of ketosis. And then, of course, we can induce ketosis, a number of other ways. We did, high-fat, low-carb ketogenic diet, where you don't even have the cycle, the daily cycle, and you just do this ad libitum to just take any circadian rhythm mechanisms out of the equation and so on. And that worked just as well, even better. We did some acute fasting experiments where we took mouse models, rat models, and even a cat model of PKD and subjected them to acute fasting just to see what happens, in the most dramatic way of doing this, and saw, interestingly, that the kidneys, actually, the polycystic kidneys shrank fairly rapidly, which was a little unexpected. And we attributed it to sort of the induction of cell death in some of these cysts, which then causes leakage of fluid. And it was a pretty dramatic finding. And also, interestingly, one experiment that I would also never have thought would work is when we decided to just, assuming that beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone that's made during ketosis, where the word ketosis comes from, what happened if we just supplement this ketone beta hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, in the drinking water to our mice, on top of just the regular high carb ad libitum fat rodent chow. And to my great surprise, that already replicated the beneficial effects of nutritional ketosis. So that was a bit of a stunning result, that it appears that the sort of the active ingredient of ketosis that has beneficial effects on the kidneys appears to be beta hydroxybutyrate itself. So that was all part of this paper we put then together and published in 2019, which made a big splash in the field, that raised a lot of eyebrows, because not only could we show that ketosis slows down progression of the disease, it actually reversed the disease. So, which was kind of unheard of at the time. But so until that point, it was really thought that PKD is relentlessly progressive, both in humans as well as in mouse models, and nobody had ever achieved a sort of at least a partial reversal of the disease, where you start out with a certain degree of renal cystic burden. You do the treatment and you end up with less of a cystic burden and less fibrosis afterwards. So that was quite kind of a new thing.
That interested me. I remember reading that study, literally cysts disappearing, right? And I thought to myself at the time, because at the time the drugs that were making a splash around the same time were the SGLT2 inhibitors, which are drugs that increase ketones, decrease blood sugar by making you urinate sort of sugar. And it had just gotten approval for chronic kidney disease around that time. And so I was like, well, this makes perfect sense. I mean, here we have, there's a big clinical demonstration of at least in chronic kidney disease, generic kidney disease, most likely related to diabetic kidney disease. But I'm not surprised to find that it ameliorated sort of, PKD, the same sort of mechanism. I mean, that was a big deal. And later, if I remember, you guys did some case series in humans, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right. Yeah. So that was an interesting project. At the time, I had a nephrologist from Germany in my lab who did his, research fellowship in my lab. And then COVID hit, and, everything got shut down in the lab. My poor fellow wasn't able to do all the mouse work he was, planning to do, and was just sitting there and couldn't do anything. So I suggested to him, hey, you're a nephrologist, you know how to talk to patients. Why don't we see, because, PKD is a fairly common disease. Many people are on ketogenic diets already, just for general health. Is it possible that there's a population of people with PKD that have already experimented with ketogenic diets? So I said, let's do a a retrospective analysis, and let's try to identify patients with PKD that have already done ketogenic metabolic therapy of one form or another, which we did because we had the time, thanks to COVID. And he identified 131 patients with polycystic kidney disease that had already done mostly ketogenic diets, some of them intermittent fasting. And we had, a long questionnaire. He did phone interviews with every single one. We got the labs from the doctors and so on, and could show that those patients on a ketogenic diet had actually improved not only their health and well-being, including like pain levels and so on, but also actually statistically significantly improved their kidney function as measured by creatinine-based EGFR, and they're all were quite convinced that this was due to the dietary interventions, and they found it actually very feasible to do, surprisingly, because that's what the doctor would think. Oh yeah, you can do a keto diet for a few weeks and then you fall off the wagon again. But these folks were on it for an average of 6 months. So it was a bit of a stunning study. Of course, there are many caveats. This was self-reported, patient-reported outcomes, a self-selected group of patients that must be assumed to be highly motivated, to begin with, to stick to a diet like this. But at least it seemed to show that there is no detrimental effects of doing ketogenic metabolic therapy in PKD. So we published this paper. That was sort of our COVID project there. And that was also sort of the justification then to go ahead and do a prospective randomized controlled trial in PKD, which we planned together with our terrific collaborators in Cologne. It's the University of Cologne in Germany. That's a group run by Dr. Roman Müller. He's the deputy chief of nephrology there, and they have the largest PKD registry in Europe. So a terrific group. They really know what they're doing. And I've been collaborating with Roman Müller and his group for a long time. So when we met at a conference, at the kidney conference, when our paper, I think our mouse and rat and cat paper wasn't even published yet, we had already started to discuss the results and decided, hey, let's plan for a clinical trial, and let's plow ahead with that. And that's a paper that just came out about 2 weeks ago with the results of the study.
Can talk a little bit about that. Well, if I remember, there was some work you did with Renew, and maybe well, before we get there, I'm interested to hear about this new paper. There was a recent sort of case series or case report that came out, and now how do you reconcile the fact that you're seeing this data in mice, in humans, this retrospective study, and you're sort of devoting your life to looking at PKD, and now you're seeing that ketosis, low carb interventions seem to ameliorate this, and certainly there's a pharmacologic corollary in SGLT2 inhibitors also affecting kidney disease. But the mainstream narrative in medicine and nephrology is that protein is damaging to the kidney, that ketosis will lead to renal failure. And in fact, there was a recent paper that you and I both commented on that said, losing weight from a keto diet, it really was, is losing weight worth losing your kidney? That was the title of the paper, and you and I both sort of came at it and criticized it. So how, have you faced some controversy sort of, if you look at the mainstream, it certainly, a higher protein, higher fat dietary approach seems to be tough for most people, most nephrologists to embrace. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is still an uphill battle for sure, because classically, as you said, the approach to chronic kidney disease has been, low protein diet, and of course, you do a high carb diet, high carb, low fat, because that's good for everything supposedly, which of course it isn't. And ketosis, for some reason, which really beats me, because I've never seen that anywhere in any scientific study. Nephrologists are convinced that ketones are somehow nephrotoxic and damage kidneys, which is, obviously not the case. And I don't even know where that came from. So, there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And actually, we just published a paper which also came out like a week or so ago. That's sort of a review paper on, rationalizing why ketogenic metabolic therapy makes sense in chronic kidney disease, and why there are many misconceptions, out there to the contrary. So I might recommend that paper. It's in the pro-con series of the Clinical Kidney Journal, CKJ. So we were invited to provide the pro position, why keto makes sense in chronic kidney disease, and somebody else wrote the anti position, which you of course should also read. But basically, I think every single clinical study that has been done to date on ketogenic metabolic therapy in chronic kidney disease, in various forms of chronic kidney disease. There's some long-term, some short-term studies. Every single one has only shown benefits. Not a single one has shown any adverse, effects affecting the kidneys or making anything get worse. So I think at this point it's fairly clear that there's just no evidence that ketogenic metabolic therapy could be detrimental in any form of chronic kidney disease. And of course, it also makes no biological sense why it should be detrimental. But it's still out there. It takes probably decades for textbooks to be updated, of course, and for medical schools to change their curriculum. And the folks that have already gone through medical school, a decade or 2 or 3 ago, it's hard for them to, catch up on the latest information out there. So it's an uphill battle.
Have you faced sort of personal scrutiny from the field? I mean, as clinicians, I'm a clinician who's very active on social media, and I'm very vocal. And so very often I get criticized, but the academic world could also be very vocal. There's meetings, there's, presentations, posters. Have you faced any criticism from colleagues in your sort of just sharing your findings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say there's actually also a surprising good number of more enlightened and open-minded nephrologists out there. They can see the science, they look at the science, they say, "Oh, this makes sense." The biological pathways make sense. And we actually have a lot of clinical collaborators that we're planning clinical trials with. So they're all, want to see the data, they want to see the outcomes, and, they are skeptical. But they think there is something to it, and that the preclinical research makes sense. But there's just as much, of colleagues out there that are, maybe not quite as open-minded, and they think of all the dangers. And luckily, they don't, they're civil enough to not, start fist fights at conferences and so on. So that's a good thing. But I think, there's a lot of kind of discussion maybe behind my back and so on also, that, saying, the crazy Weimbs guy, what's he doing, and so on. I think the only way to overcome this is just to have clinical studies, and have well-designed clinical studies done not just by me but by other colleagues.
What you did with a great team, and maybe you can go through the results of this most recent study, which I think was one of the only nutrition intervention studies I've seen in PKD. So can you talk a little bit about this study?
Yeah, so this was intended to be just a pilot study to look primarily at feasibility and safety of ketogenic intervention in PKD. And as I said, this was entirely run by Dr. Roman Müller's group in Cologne. I just merely helped to sort of conceptualize the study in the beginning, helped to round up some funding from the PKD Foundation for it. It's a prospective randomized study using 3 arms. So a ketogenic diet group, a periodic fasting group, where patients were fasted for 3 days per month, just water fasting 3 days in a row per month for the 3 months intervention, and a control group, so no change in diet. So intervention period was only 3 months, so very, very short term. And the outcomes were, kind of very surprising. So of course, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but as we had anticipated, was that patients did rate the dietary interventions as feasible. And probably the ketogenic diet was a little bit more feasible than the 3-day water fasting. But then surprisingly, looking at kidney function after only 3 months, in the control group, there was maybe a slight decline in kidney function, as you would expect. But in the ketogenic diet group, there was actually an improvement in kidney function. So the eGFR numbers, the estimated glomerular filtration rate numbers actually increased, which is not something that happens in PKD, but it only relentlessly goes down. When we initially presented these data in an abstract a year ago at the kidney conference in the US here, there was some initial feedback saying, creatinine-based kidney function means nothing in a dietary study because creatinine is influenced by meat intake and so on, which is true. Although there was no change really in meat intake or protein intake in the ketogenic diet group compared to the control. But then we reanalyzed the data with a different marker that's actually independent of creatinine. That's called cystatin C. And it was exactly the same data. So still a statistically significant improvement in kidney function based on cystatin C. So that was just published now. There was also a non-significant trend in the trajectory of total kidney volume. And that's something that's a bit unique in polycystic kidney disease because of all these cysts that grow in the kidneys. The kidneys grow over time, and they can get very, very large, and they can get many times the size of a normal kidney. And we can measure total kidney volume by just MRI scanning and quantifying the MRIs. And that's a sort of a surrogate marker for the progression of the disease. And surprisingly enough, the total kidney volume actually decreased in the ketogenic diet group and somewhat increased in the control group. This just missed statistical significance by a hair, so it's only a trend at this point. But I think nobody would even have expected to see a trend after only 3 months intervention. All of the clinical trials that have been done so far, for drug approval, there's only one approved drug, for example. They looked at much longer time points, something like 3-year intervention.
Was that for the PKD? Remind me the drug that's approved.
Yeah, it's called tolvaptan. It's a vasopressin receptor antagonist.
Vaptan.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, and that's indicated for PKD.
Yeah, it's FDA approved for PKD and has been on the market for how long? Several years already. And it's the one and only drug, and it has I would call it maybe perhaps modest efficacy, but it's the only drug. So whatever it is, it is. It only slows the progression of polycystic kidney disease. It does not stop the progression, let alone reverse anything. So it might buy patients, a little bit of time, in their progression towards kidney failure, but it doesn't prevent it. Unfortunately, it comes with, side effects. So there's polyuria. The patients, drink a ton of water and they pee out. They pee a lot, day and night, essentially. So it's quite an impact on the lifestyle of patients. There's also liver toxicity associated with it. So, and it's not universally available. There's sort of fairly restricted inclusion criteria on who would qualify for it and so on. Yeah, but compared to all the drug trials that have been done so far that looked at really long-term outcomes, our little pilot study only looked at 3-month outcomes. And yet there were already was statistically significant improvement in eGFR, which was a huge surprise and a trend towards kidney volume. So the study was just Dr. Müller presented it a couple of weeks ago at the Kidney Week conference, the largest kidney conference by the American Society for Nephrology, which I think made a big splash. And then a few days later, the paper just came out as well. So we're, of course, now very interested in longer term studies. And that's something we're planning right now.
And, we had talked offline a little bit about, using sort of, the sort of industry and private industry accelerate sort of some of this, just like, you can find these amazing findings and pharmaceutical research can be, expedited with some funding. So you mentioned, now there's a company to sort of support this idea of a nutritional intervention. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So that's something, after we made those findings that, ketosis is highly beneficial in PKD and that we could mimic the effects by just supplementing with beta-hydroxybutyrate. So that seemed like really good news because beta-hydroxybutyrate, is already widely available as a supplement. It's fairly inexpensive, fairly safe to use. At the same time, we had made another discovery where we found that these microcrystals that can form day in, day out in kidneys, such as calcium oxalate microcrystals and uric acid and so on, that these microcrystals are highly damaging to polycystic kidneys and strongly accelerates the progression of the disease. And you can antagonize these microcrystals with, again, very simple measures such as citrate supplementation. So the simple compound citric acid citrate, because it chelates calcium, it prevents calcium oxalate microcrystal formation, and we had found it to be highly effective in our animal models of PKD again. But so the good news is then there's these two very inexpensive compounds, BHB and citrate, that seem to be highly beneficial in polycystic kidney disease. But the bad news is that those are two inexpensive, widely available compounds, which means that the pharmaceutical industry would not be interested in doing anything with that, right? Because you can't possibly sink hundreds of millions of dollars into clinical trials just to then have a drug that only consists of ingredients that anyone can already get on Amazon for very cheap. So it was clear to me that the research that we had done would never lead to anything, any product or any compound that would benefit patients. So we essentially decided to just do it ourselves and launch a company. And that's called Santa Barbara Nutrients. It was a little bit of a lucky circumstance. So a terrific group of people that I knew and got to know came together. Most of them actually have polycystic kidney disease, and they're sort of industry experts in one area or another. So we all came together, launched this company, and came up with a formulation for a medical food called ketosis. So that's not a drug and not a supplement, not a food, but a medical food. And most people have never heard of medical foods. That's actually a separate FDA-regulated category. So, besides foods and drugs and supplements and devices, the FDA also regulates what's called medical foods. So the trick of medical foods is that essentially the ingredients have to be approved food ingredients. So they have to be what's called GRAS, G-R-A-S, generally recognized as safe, which all of the ingredients that we're talking about are. So we were able to put this together as a medical food labeled for polycystic kidney disease and chronic kidney disease. And it's essentially a blend of the exogenous ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate together with citrate to antagonize these microcrystals. And it delivers sort of an alkaline base, about 50 milliequivalents of alkaline base, which helps to bring the urine pH back up more into the normal range of these patients. So this medical food has been out on the market for a couple of years already, and we like so anyone can just essentially take it on its own, but we always recommend to combine it with diet and lifestyle changes, and have actually set up a dietary intervention program, which was a really amazing collaboration with terrific renal dietitians. So that is a 3-month group program where patients learn to implement a kidney-safe ketogenic diet that avoids these renal stressors that we found to be detrimental, such as oxalate, inorganic food, phosphate food additives, high uric acid precursors, and so on, and also incorporates this medical food, ketosis. So it's a fully remote program that has already had 150 to 200 patients go through, in class settings of about 20 patients per class. I would say it has been very successful. So we're actually putting data together now in a paper that we're trying to put out on the outcomes of these people that went through the Renew program. But there's lots of feedback from these patients. Pain, for example, is one of the outcomes that seems to be very strongly beneficially affected. And the pain in PKD, sort of the kidney pain, comes from the fact that these kidneys just get severely enlarged and cause pain for a number of reasons, and that seems to improve pretty dramatically. We see very consistently improvements in kidney function as well, hypertension, blood glucose control, and so on. And that's called the Renew program for renal nutrition. And now we have been planning for the last couple of years a number of clinical trials to look at long-term outcomes of patients that go through the Renew program and use ketosis. So these trials are coming up early next year. There's one trial at the University of Toronto with Dr. Jörg Pei, where we look at 40 patients in the intervention and 40 controls. And we have sort of a duplicate study protocol in Tokyo at Juntendo University in Tokyo with Dr. Horie, where we're looking at 100 patients intervention and 100 controls, each of them are looking at 1-year outcomes. And I think ultimately, what you mentioned.
Duration.
Sorry?
Much longer in duration. Yes,
exactly right. Yeah. And, I think ultimately, to overcome sort of the skepticism of nephrologists, which is understandable because they're have been doing this for a long time. To overcome this, I think the only way is to really have clinical data, clinical studies, controlled studies, and publish them in the scientific literature. So this is all coming up. We're collaborating with a number of other investigators, including back at the Cleveland Clinic, where I originally got my start there. We're working with Dr. Turban at Johns Hopkins University, and with Dr. Marcus Seaman at the University in Vienna. So there's a whole number of clinical trials that we have in the pipeline there.
That sounds very interesting. It's just amazing work, and I applaud you for your lifelong sort of passion in the space, and your lifelong really career-long effort to bring awareness to this, and taking that extra step to bringing something to market when there's no sort of viable and regulatory pathway. So kudos to you on every front. And what should we look forward to next?
Yeah, I would say, I'm personally looking very much forward to the outcomes of those clinical trials. Unfortunately, it's, the long-term trials, this will take a while. But I think this will be then a game changer and lead to a lot more, opening up of dietary interventions for not only PKD, but other forms of chronic kidney disease as well. I'm looking
I find it amazing, like we give out medications that reduce sugar. We give out medications that lower blood pressure. We certainly can give out dietary interventions that do the same thing. And I have seen in my own clinic kidney disease reverse with low carb and ketogenic diets. Dr. Unwin has published on this, and it's good to see people like you just basically validating it and taking it to the next level when it comes to science. This is exactly what we need, and we need year-long studies, which I know are not easy to do and neither cheap to do. So kudos to you, and thank you for doing all the work that you've done.
Absolutely, yeah. And I must say, just to get some kudos back, it's actually amazing. If you look at medical textbooks, there's no mention of ketogenic metabolic therapy. I actually had to learn, once we stumbled on our, research results, and I had to learn about ketogenic metabolic therapy from podcasts and YouTubes and so on, because there's just nothing out there, very little out there. So it's, I think what you do, education is just as important, and getting the word out there. So you're definitely getting the attention not only of patients, but also scientists and other practitioners, which I think is highly valuable.
Yeah, let me tell you, so now we have a ketogenic textbook, which is an amazing textbook for any doctor, dietitian, scientist who wants to explore the space. It's the official textbook of the SMHP. It was written and edited by the Nutrition Network, which is Tim Noakes's group in South Africa. All of our board members were involved in editing those chapters. And the SMHP is a growing group of metabolic practitioners, about 500 members strong and growing. And we have now a journal, the Journal of Metabolic Health. We've inherited the Journal of Insulin Resistance, and help them sort of elevate what that journal becomes. And it's been very challenging to do all this, but we've done a lot in the past 5 years, and look forward to maybe inviting you for commentary, maybe getting you to come lecture us on these topics, so we can make sure that everybody from a health coach to a dietitian to a physician or an NP/PA, to scientists, they're all sort of up to speed on the importance of diet and nutrition on PKD and globally the kidney disease. So maybe we can create like a symposium, maybe one of these days we'll get the SMHP to do a kidney symposium or something like this. So I look forward to the
Absolutely.
days. Let's put it that way.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. No, those are fantastic initiatives. And, I'm actually very confident that, maybe 10 years down the road, maybe 15, who knows, we will see a completely different landscape, and that metabolic therapies will be the standard therapy, the first line of therapy. Hopefully, we can get there, and everything else will hopefully be regarded as, medical malpractice at some point. So we'll
Some
get
of
there.
us regard it that way now. So
Yes, exactly right.
listen, I thank you so much. And if somebody wanted to contact you, somebody with PKD or where do they go? Where do they find out about Santa Barbara? Like, how do they find you and anything that they should, if somebody's out there with PKD or has a family with PKD, what should they do?
Great question. So I have a very popular Facebook group that's just called Weimbs Lab. So it's easy to find. That has about 3,000 or 4,000 people with PKD on it. Lots of discussions there. People help each other out. Lots of peer support. So anyone is welcome to join that. Santa Barbara Nutrients is easy to find. Just Google it, and you can get all the information on this medical food, ketosis. There's lots of dietary information, dietary recommendations. There's also links to this Renew program that I mentioned, where patients can sign up for, and if they're motivated to go through a program like this. So I think the word is getting out there. Ideally, patients can twist the arms of their nephrologists and maybe bring them the latest published paper that we talked about, the randomized controlled trial, just to be armed with some arguments, because that seems to happen a lot, that patients learn all about what we have been doing, and they get essentially shut down by the nephrologist by saying, "Oh, I don't believe in this." So bring a paper with you to your next appointment. I think that might be a good thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Empowering patients is the number one way to improve health, in my opinion. Thank you so much, good doctor, for coming. And we'll certainly include the paper in the show notes, and we'll be posting this on social media. And I can't wait for our listeners to hear about this.
Super. Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much.